I was finishing up a late shift at the precinct when the call came through. It was just after midnight. The department was quiet, most officers had already returned to their posts, and the few of us left were just going through the motions of a routine night. Then, the dispatcher's voice came through the radio. Tight, clipped, and with a sense of urgency that had my stomach turning even before she spoke. Unit 24, we have a 10 to 36 in progress. 203 Pine Street. Caller reports multiple 10-13s. Over. I wasn't even sure what I was hearing. 10 to 36 was code for a distress call, but 10 to 13? That was reserved for something far worse. An officer down, someone in grave danger. Panic hit me as I grabbed my keys and ran to my patrol car. My partner, Officer Rachel Turner, jumped in without a word, knowing the weight of the call. We were just minutes from the address. As we sped down the empty street, I tried to calm my racing mind. Pine Street was notorious for its old, crumbling houses, and this was a part of town we usually avoided unless there was a clear reason. As we approached the block, a strange feeling settled over me. Something I couldn't quite shake. Felt like someone was watching us. When we pulled up to the address, the lights of the house flickered erratically, like the power was surging. The front door was wide open, swinging slightly in the wind. No sign of life. My heart rate quickened as we stepped out of the car, weapons drawn. "Stay sharp," Rachel muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, but my focus was elsewhere. Something wasn't right. We approached the door cautiously, and as we crossed the threshold, a thick, metallic smell hit us. Blood? Couldn't tell. The air was thick and sticky, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. The interior was eerily still, but there were sounds, soft scuffling noises from the upstairs hallway. I took a deep breath and motioned for Rachel to follow. We crept toward the staircase, each step creaking louder than the last. The darkened house seemed to close in around us as we ascended. At the top of the stairs, we found a room with its door ajar. I pushed it open, and that's when we saw it. As I pushed the door open, the smell hit us again, stronger this time, foul, almost nauseating. The room was dimly lit by a single, flickering light bulb that seemed on the verge of burning out. There were old, worn furniture pieces scattered around the room, their fabric torn and stained. But none of that mattered when my eyes landed on the blood. It wasn't just a trickle or a pool. The walls were smeared with it. The floor was soaked, and it seemed to have spread out in unnatural patterns, like it was alive, stretching toward the corners of the room. My stomach churned, and I had to fight the bile rising in my throat. Rachel's face was pale, and she clenched her jaw, trying to steady herself. Then we saw him. Lying in the center of the room, sprawled out on the floor, was an officer, his uniform unmistakable. I immediately recognized the badge, but my blood froze when I saw his face. His eyes were wide open, but they were empty, lifeless. His neck had been twisted at an impossible angle, and blood pooled beneath him. The grotesque scene was too much to take in all at once. But the worst part wasn't just the body. It was the message. Scrawled on the wall, in what I could only assume was more blood, was a single word: run. It was written in jagged, frantic letters, as if someone had been desperately trying to communicate something. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. The officer, the blood, the warning. But before I could process anything further, a soft creak came from behind us. I spun around, instinctively raising my weapon, but there was nothing there. Just the open door and the empty hallway beyond. My nerves were shot. Something was wrong here, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. "We need to get out of here," Rachel said, her voice low and shaky, but I didn't move. Couldn't. A whisper, faint but distinct, echoed from the back of the room. It was barely audible, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. I strained to hear it, my heart pounding. "Help me." The voice was soft, almost childlike. My gut twisted in knots. Who could be in here? Who was still alive? The officer on the floor was clearly dead. But the voice, it came from somewhere behind the darkened corners of the room. Rachel moved closer to me, her hand hovering near her radio, but I stopped her with a gesture. The voice had come from here. There was someone, still in the house. "Who's there?" I called, my voice echoing off the walls. The air felt heavier, like we were being suffocated by the very building itself. The whisper came again, but this time it was clearer. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a command. "Leave now." I didn't hesitate. We bolted, rushing toward the door. But as I turned to run, something slammed into my back with enough force to send me sprawling forward. My hands hit the floor hard, scraping against the wooden boards. I grunted in pain, trying to regain my footing. But before I could fully get up, I heard a low growl, a sound so unnatural that it froze the blood in my veins. I turned to see a figure standing at the far corner of the room, half hidden in the shadows. It wasn't a person, not anymore. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin. Its teeth sharp, glistening, and far too many. The figure took a slow step forward, dragging something behind it, a length of chain that clinked with every movement. Rachel was already on her feet, her gun aimed directly at the creature, but her hands were shaking. I could see it in her eyes. She was terrified just like me, but we had no choice. We had to fight. I managed to push myself up and shout, "Get back!" at Rachel, hoping she'd understand the urgency of the situation. The creature didn't flinch, didn't even seem to acknowledge us. It just continued to shuffle forward, its movements jerky, as if it didn't quite know how to move its body. Rachel fired, the shot ringing through the room. But the creature didn't even flinch. It just smiled. "We need to go. Now," I shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the door. But as we ran, I heard the sound of the chain scraping the floor, then the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind us. Slow, deliberate. I wasn't sure if it was chasing us or if we were just imagining it, but I didn't want to find out. The hallway seemed longer than before, the walls closing in, the air thicker. We reached the stairs, but just as I was about to turn the corner, I felt a sharp pain in my shoulder. My breath caught, and I staggered, nearly falling down the stairs. Rachel grabbed me, pulling me back to my feet. "Keep going," she yelled, but the words were barely audible over the sound of the creature's footsteps getting louder, faster. We were almost at the door when I felt it, cold, clammy fingers wrapping around my ankle. I screamed in terror, kicking out blindly, but the grip tightened. The thing was pulling me back into the darkness of the house. I could see the faint glow of its eyes just a few feet away from me. Rachel's voice cut through the panic. "I've got you." She yanked me hard, and with all the strength I had left, I managed to pull myself free. We ran for the door, barely making it outside before I heard a sharp crack, like something breaking. I glanced back just in time to see the door slam shut on its own. The house was still, deadly still. I didn't dare stop to catch my breath. We didn't even look at each other. We just kept running, not knowing what was chasing us or what had happened to that officer in the house. I couldn't shake the feeling that the thing wasn't done with us. As we reached the parking lot, I finally dared to look at Rachel. Her face was pale, sweat dripping from her forehead. She looked like she had seen a ghost. I was about to speak, but then I heard it again. A whisper, faint but unmistakable, riding on the wind. Not finished yet. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty street, the dim glow of the streetlights. Rachel grabbed my arm, her voice trembling. "We have to call for backup. We're not done." I nodded, but deep down, I knew something worse was coming. I just didn't know what or when. The drive back to the precinct was a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that the thing we'd encountered wasn't just a figment of our imagination. Rachel kept glancing nervously into the rearview mirror, as if she expected to see those glowing eyes staring back at her. I wanted to tell her it was all in our heads, that it was over, but deep down I knew better. Something had followed us. When we arrived, the lights in the precinct were dim, and most of the officers were either wrapping up their shifts or getting ready for their morning rounds. The quiet was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat thumping in my ears. I had to make the call. We had to report what we'd seen, what had happened. But as soon as I stepped inside, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something was wrong. The first thing I noticed was the silence. There were no voices, no sounds of phones ringing or radios crackling, just the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above. I walked into the bullpen, expecting to find the usual bustle of activity, but the room was completely empty. "Where is everyone?" Rachel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, stepping further into the room. The office doors were open, but there was no one inside. Not a single officer. My stomach twisted in confusion, then fear. We couldn't have been the only ones to hear the call about the officer down. "Dispatch," I said, moving toward the radio. But before I could get a word in, the static crackled to life, followed by a voice. Faint and distorted, like someone was trying to speak through a fog. "Go to the warehouse, 5th and West. They're waiting for you." The voice was garbled, hard to make out, but the urgency in it was unmistakable. I looked at Rachel, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. She didn't need to ask. We both knew the same thing. We had to go. I grabbed the keys to one of the squad cars, and we were back on the road, speeding toward the warehouse. The place was on the outskirts of town, tucked away in a decrepit industrial district. It was the last place anyone would willingly go at this hour. As we neared the location, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end again. The whole area felt wrong. When we arrived, the scene was like something out of a nightmare. The warehouse loomed in front of us, its windows blacked out, the door slightly ajar. No lights, no sounds, just silence, thick and heavy. "Stay close," I whispered to Rachel, my voice barely audible. We both knew this wasn't going to be anything like the call. This was different. We weren't just responding to a crime. We were walking into something that had been waiting for us. As we entered the warehouse, the temperature dropped. It felt as though we had crossed into another world. Cold, lifeless, and suffocating. The dim light from the street lamps barely pierced through the cracked windows, casting eerie shadows on the piles of crates stacked around us. There was no one in sight. But then the sound came, a low, guttural growl like something inhuman. The noise echoed through the empty space, coming from somewhere deep within the warehouse. "Did you hear that?" Rachel whispered, her grip tightening around her flashlight. Before I could respond, a shadow shifted in the distance. And then I saw them. My heart pounded in my chest as I squinted into the darkness. There, emerging from behind a stack of crates, were figures, more of them. Shadows moving unnaturally, slowly. Their shapes were distorted, like they were struggling to maintain their form, half human and half something else entirely. My stomach twisted with an unease I couldn't describe. I reached for my radio, but my fingers were shaking. Couldn't get a word out. The growling intensified, growing louder, as if it was closing in on us. It wasn't just one thing anymore, it was multiple. I looked at Rachel, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear, but she was still holding her ground. We stepped back cautiously, but it was too late. From the darkened corner of the warehouse, one of the figures lunged at us with terrifying speed. It was upon me before I could react, its cold, clammy hands gripping my shoulders like iron. The stench of decay hit me full force, and I nearly gagged. Its eyes, those glowing, inhuman eyes, locked onto mine, and for a moment, I felt like I was paralyzed. I shoved the thing away, finally managing to get a breath and pull my gun. My hands were so slick with sweat that I nearly dropped it. But I fired. The first shot hit, but it didn't go down. It barely even flinched. The creature snarled, pulling itself back and coming at me again. "Rachel, move!" I yelled, but I barely heard my own voice over the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. She fired too. A shot rang out, but it too seemed to have no effect. The creature's grin spread wider, its teeth sharp like daggers. I could see now that its skin was stretched, twisted, as though it had been sewn together from parts of different creatures. Its mouth opened wide, ready to consume me. Then, as quickly as it had attacked, it stopped. It turned its head, and for a split second, I saw something strange. Its eyes widened in recognition. But what it was looking at wasn't me. It was Rachel. In that moment of hesitation, Rachel shoved me aside and fired a second shot, directly at the creature's chest. This time, it howled in pain, falling back with a sickening thud. But it wasn't dead. No, far from it. It scrambled back to its feet in an instant, more ferocious than before. And then I heard the worst sound of all, the sound of more footsteps, echoing through the darkened warehouse. They were coming toward us. Hundreds of them, at least it felt that way. Rachel grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the exit. But we weren't going to make it. We were cornered. I could feel the weight of the air pressing in on us, suffocating us. The growls were all around now, everywhere. We were surrounded. The things, whatever they were closing in fast. Get to the door. I screamed. But the fear in my voice wasn't enough to hide the panic. We ran, but the door seemed miles away, the shadows stretching longer with each passing second. We were almost there. I could see the faint light of the street lamps outside, a beacon in the dark. But before we could reach it, I heard the unmistakable sound of the door slamming shut. The entrance was blocked. We were trapped. I spun around, breathing hard, trying to find a way out. The creatures, no longer just shadows, were emerging from every direction. Some were humanoid, but others were something else entirely. Their forms shifted, melted, as though they couldn't decide what they wanted to be. Their eyes glowed in the dark like predators on the hunt. I glanced at Rachel, my pulse racing. We couldn't fight this. No amount of firepower would save us. But then, something strange happened. The creatures froze. They all stopped, their eyes locked on something behind me. I turned around, dread seizing my chest, my breath catching in my throat. And then I saw it. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure, a man. He was tall, dressed in a long black coat, his face hidden in shadow. I couldn't see his eyes, but somehow, I knew he was the one the creatures were waiting for. A chill ran down my spine as the man stepped forward, the room seeming to grow colder with each movement. The creatures didn't move. They didn't growl or lunge. They were still, as if in reverence, watching the figure as he approached us. It was as if he held dominion over them. "Who are you?" Rachel managed to whisper, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and confusion. The man didn't answer immediately. He only raised his hand, and with a single motion, the creatures seemed to recoil, retreating into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as they had appeared. It was like they had been dismissed. But the fear didn't leave. Not yet. "You should have never come here," the man finally spoke. His voice was deep, gravelly, and it sent a shiver down my spine. "Who the hell are you?" I demanded, stepping between Rachel and the figure. I wasn't sure if I was protecting her or trying to protect myself. My heart was racing, and I could barely catch my breath. The man didn't answer right away. He merely took another step forward, his presence overwhelming. The temperature in the room dropped even further, and I could see my breath now, frost forming in the air. The darkness seemed to close in tighter around us. "I am their keeper," he said finally, his voice low, "and I have been watching you." "Watching us? Who are you, really?" Rachel's voice cracked, fear lacing her words. The man didn't respond right away. He just stared at us, his expression unreadable in the dim light. For a long moment, there was silence, thick and suffocating. And then, in one swift movement, he extended his hand, and a thin, almost invisible thread of light shot out from his fingers. The light moved quickly, wrapping around my wrist, pulling me toward him. My legs buckled, and I felt an unnatural force yank me forward. I tried to resist, but the pull was overwhelming. Rachel screamed, but I couldn't hear her. The world was spinning, the shadows closing in, and the figure in front of me grew larger and larger until it seemed like he was towering over me. "You should have stayed away," he repeated, and this time his voice wasn't just cold. It was deadly. And then, as suddenly as the force had come, it vanished. I was free, but not for long. The man didn't need to speak. With a single gesture, I felt the pressure in my chest release, but the weight of fear lingered. The creatures, the darkness, all of it felt like it was pulling me into some otherworldly abyss. In that moment, everything seemed to stop. The cold, the fear, the chaos. It all became still. I took one last look at Rachel. Her face was as pale as mine, but there was something else in her eyes. Something unspoken. A realization. I knew what she was thinking. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And before I could say anything else, the man in the black coat spoke one final time. "Leave while you still can," he said, his voice a mere whisper. "The real nightmare is yet to come." And then he was gone. The warehouse was silent now. The creatures had vanished. The air was no longer cold. But I knew we weren't safe. Not really. Whatever had been unleashed here had no intention of letting us go. We didn't stay to investigate further. We ran. But as we stepped outside, into the night air, I felt something. Something I can't explain. Watching us. It wasn't over. And I don't think it ever will be.